Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome to Unlearning Economics. Today, we are unlearning behavioural economics with Professor Nick Shater, who is the author of It's on You, long subtitle, How Corporations and Behavioural Scientists Have Convinced Us That We're to Blame for Society's Deepest Problems. Thank you for coming, Nick.
Well, lovely to be here.
Yeah, so this book is really all about the limitations of nudge and what behavioral science can offer. And I have to say, I've been following your work along with George Loewenstein, your co-author, on this topic for quite a long time. And it was out of the blue that I got this email, which delighted me for two reasons. One was that you were writing the book at all, which I didn't know. I didn't realize you were writing a book summarizing everything, for the general reader. And secondly, that you wanted to chat on my channel. So yeah, thank you so much.
Well, no,
Uh,
it's a great to have the opportunity.
so I want to open by talking about when you first met George Loewenstein, because
Mm,
you discussed this a little bit in the book, but I'd like to hear more.
mm,
You say that you were at one of these many conferences on nudging, and this was when we thought, we had really high hopes for nudging. We thought that we could
mm.
solve big social problems with little changes in people's choice environment that were very low cost, very unobtrusive, and then you, I think, just went to the pub with George at some point
Mm.
during the conference or after it,
Yes.
and you said it gradually dawned on both of you that you had similar misgivings about this whole approach. Could you tell us more about that conversation?
Yes. And I don't know if it's exactly the first time we ever met. It may be. It was certainly around 2010, 2011, in the first flush of enthusiasm for Nudge. So the book Nudge came out in 2008, which was by Dick Thaler and Cass Sunstein. So Dick Thaler being a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Cass Sunstein being one of the US's leading legal scholars. So very, very brilliant people. And the book had a really tremendous influence on politics, and especially most immediately in UK politics. So when David Cameron took over as Prime Minister in 2010, he advised his cabinet members to read the book, and not only that, set up a unit, the Behavioural Insights team, which still exists, and is actually a very impressive group of people, which initially was part of the Cabinet Office, which was aimed to implement the kind of insights from nudge type thinking to make government work better. And the sort of core idea of this is and this was such an attractive idea to George and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. The core idea is to say that while we have these very traditional heavy-handed policy levers we're all aware of, so changing the law, subsidizing things, taxing things, all these kinds of things that we're familiar with, um, a lot of the time politics is quite deadlocked, and also, at least in any time after 2008, finance is pretty tight, and that's continued ever since. So if you're a politician trying to make political progress, a very natural strategy is to think, well, is there anything we can do which doesn't use these heavy-handed levers, which might be very expensive, but also just politically very difficult to get through? And the magic of nudge and a slightly broader family of ideas, which is based on the individual rather than sort of the changing the system, is to say, well, maybe we can actually go direct to the individual behaviors that each of us is engaging in, which are causing the problem. So we take some problem like, say, the epidemic of obesity, which has been growing, especially in the US, but in the UK and across Europe and across many other parts of the world. And we say to ourselves, well, hang on. So people are clearly making the wrong food choices here. We want them to eat more healthily. So we need to directly target those individuals to get them to make better decisions. So, for example, we might make default portion sizes smaller. We might change the location of different foodstuffs in shops. We might change the way calorie labels are provided. So we might just change the environment, change the nature of the choices people are seeing, which will help them avoid the tendency to eat the wrong things and eat too much of them. So that's the sort of the idea that by nudging people, with nothing heavy-handed here, we're not banning anything, we're not changing the price of anything, we're just encouraging people to see the problem differently and helping them to choose what is essentially the best thing. And the idea would be that if we don't do that, then quite often the thing that they're going to be nudged towards is the worst thing, or the thing that's most beneficial to the seller of the product, say. And so we want to use nudges and other types of individual interventions for good. And I suppose the hope early in the Cameron administration, and I was both George and I were advisors to the Behavioural Insights team. We were on its academic advisory board. So the thought that seemed so powerful then was that we might be able to really make inroads into issues like public health, climate change, and so on by this very direct new route. And I think the kind of conversation George and I started having after our, I think it was a meeting of the Behavioural Insights Team Advisory Board. In fact, we started having a conversation which along the lines of, oh, this is surprisingly hard to actually think of any really good ideas. I mean, like we're sort of thinking it's something on the hook. Here we are. We're brought here to have as academics to have these great ideas, and we find ourselves thinking, well, like, all my ideas seem a bit sort of feeble and a bit sort of marginal. Is it just me? And I think the sort of light bulb moment, which I think, to be honest, it was a light that came on sort of slowly rather than instantly, but the gradual dawning realization for both of us was, it isn't just us. We are struggling to think of good proposals. When we test things, they don't seem to work very well. Maybe it's we're just trying to use the wrong tools here. This idea that we can really make big changes by just individualistic interventions. It's just not working.
Yeah, it's like some of them are a bit cute, aren't they, nudges? I think you've got like one of the ones that sticks out, and I think that they use this, admittedly they used it because it's cute, but in the original book there was like the fly on the urinal one, where it's like put a picture of a fly on a urinal and men will aim at it and it said they reduced spillage by 80%. I don't know where that statistic came from and who gathered that information.
I'm not sure there's much validation behind that.
No. But like, it was that kind of thing. And I think while we can all appreciate that there are changes in our choice environment that we can make that will benefit us, when you're running up against a problem, you mentioned obesity, climate change, it does seem like we can't really solve these things with these minor tweaks in what they call choice architecture. And so, I mean, one of the really interesting points that you make, which is, it's one that I think I've heard before, but when you said it, I was like, oh, right. You say that there are all these biases and heuristics in behavioral economics and behavioral science, right? Like present bias is one. People value the present over the future. And you say that there's actually very little evidence. So you say there's a bias, then you say you're going to correct the bias. There's very little evidence that these biases actually explain the problems that they're supposed to explain, like obesity. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So yes, present bias is the poster child example. So it seems like the problem with obesity must be that people are confronting a cake, as I do myself, and thinking, probably better be for me not to eat that cake. But on the other hand, it's very nice, and I'd like to eat it. I'm just going to eat it. Oh, there it's. I've eaten it now. So you have that kind of the powerful attraction of the cake is just overwhelms you, and you eat it. And it's very easy to think, well, it must be because people are more concerned about the present than the future. But you think, oh, of course that's going to be true with things like sort of smoking, alcohol consumption, failing to save, spending too much, getting into credit card debt. They can all be put in this basket of present bias. But the trouble is, they just don't correlate with each other. So these problems, it's not like there are people who have lots of very high present bias and who are just going around doing all kinds of present bias things. The people who have one fall into one trap are not the same people who fall into other traps. In general, there are some correlations, but that's not the driver. And so the thought that there's this sort of single discounting the future too severely, the future's just so far away, I discount it too much. Thinking that's the problem is a mistake. And it's also true that the very people who are falling supposedly into present bias are also doing things like training to be doctors, which is like, if you're training to be a doctor, or just doing a degree, or all sorts of things we do in our lives, or just starting any kind of career. They have enormously long time horizons, and we seem to manage to do those quite well. So the thought that people are these kind of myopic kind of animals, sort of trapped in the moment, I think it's just not really true to the rest of the full richness of human behavior. So yes, I think it's an illusion. So the analogy that we talk a little bit about in the book, which I think is a useful one, is if you think that the social problems come about because people are suffering from these psychological frailties, they're imprudent, they're biased towards the present, they're selfish and so on. If you think that's the problem, it's a bit like saying the problem with people, if as physical creatures, is they're terribly prone to dying of the cold, and if you don't feed them properly, they get malnourished, and so people are kind of delicate physical beings. And we don't solve that problem by thinking, well, we need to nudge people to wear woolly jumpers and to remember to eat and so on. We solve that problem by providing people with shelter and good healthcare and sanitation, and just building enormously complicated systems which support our frail physiologies. And the obvious answer to how we deal with our psychological frailties is exactly the same. And we do. I mean, that's what society's like. We continually, so for example, going back to training to be a doctor, it's an enormously long battle. So we have all these little way stations and sort of markers and exams and continual feedback and social support. And so it's not the case that that society doesn't automatically create all this sort of infrastructure to help people. But when things are going wrong, the answer can't be, we need to, in general, it can't be, we need to fix the human frailty any more than if people are dying of hypothermia. The real solution is going to be encouraging them to wear woolly jumpers or have a thermometer in their kitchen. What you really want to be doing is helping warm their homes and having well insulated, well heated housing stock and so on.
I really like the physiological analogy, because one of the things about behavioral economics, the seemingly strange things, is that despite being anti sort of rational behavior as proposed in the sort of bare bones mainstream neoclassical model, it kind of reaffirms that rational model as like a normative model, right? As like what we should be. So it's like people are present biased, right? They shouldn't be present biased. We should fix them and we should get them like closer. And I was thinking about your physiological analogy, and I just felt like, it was as if we'd created this model of humans where they maybe didn't need food and they didn't need sleep, and they could fly as well as like walking and stuff. And then we said, well, the fact that they deviate from all of this is some kind of bias, so therefore we need to correct it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it's fundamentally the wrong starting point to say people are kind of flawed creatures who are making these terrible mistakes. We need to help them, fix those mistakes. I mean, it's a bit like sort of another analogy to have in mind is something like is sports. So if you think about something like football, where if you had, once upon a time, there were really pretty much no rules of football. It was just a sort of violent brawl with a pig's bladder bouncing up and down the village. And that gradually mutated into something quite well regulated. And you have to have all sorts of rules for sending people off if they tackle dangerously, and having bans for dangerous play and so on. And you have to have referees to enforce them, and you have to have line judges and lines people. And so you have all of this all of this machinery gets built to make the game function properly. And if some aspects of the game doesn't work very well, so for example, if you do get lots of tackles which are injuring people, it would be a completely hopeless strategy to say, well, that's human nature again failing us. We need to. People are just being too selfish, and they're thinking winning is more important than the broken leg of their opponents. So we need to help them realize what they're doing, and to be more moral or something of this kind. And we don't do that. We realize that's a completely hopeless strategy. And what we should be doing is changing the rules so that, as it were, crime doesn't pay, bad things don't pay. And I think the truth about humans, which is blindingly obvious to all of us, is that we're incredibly complicated and sophisticated creatures who are coping with an immensely complicated world. It's the idea that we're sort of fundamentally flawed is kind of not a reverse of the truth, really. I mean, we are the most remarkable creatures that have ever existed in the universe, as far as we know. We cope with an amazingly complicated and ever-changing environment pretty well. We're not perfect. We can't cope with absolutely everything. And when things go wrong, we need to adjust the way we run things rather than trying to adjust ourselves.
Would you say that you've been influenced? I'm not sure I saw his name, although I might be misremembering. But have you been influenced a lot by Herbert Simon on? on this view?
Yes, we have actually, and I don't know if we do talk about Simon. It must be referenced somewhere, I suppose. But Herbert Simon is certainly very relevant here. So Simon um, was at Carnegie Mellon, which is where George is, and I think is one of the reasons why Carnegie Mellon is such a massive hotbed of work in cognitive sciences and behavioral sciences in general, because he was such a huge figure, and another Nobel Prize winner, but not only a Nobel Prize winner for economics, for his contributions on the boundaries of economics and psychology, but also one of the founders of AI as well. So it's a good old-fashioned symbolic AI. He was one of the key people who created that. So it's an enormously significant figure. And Simon, because he was interested in really complex problems, the kind of things that you needed a genuine artificial intelligence to deal with, or a human intelligence, of course, this very sort of simplistic, we've got utilities, every outcome has a utility, we're trying to choose actions which give the highest expected utility. That's how humans behave. That kind of perspective always seemed completely useless to someone like Simon, because Simon would have said, well, okay, let's try that with chess. Can you calculate the expected utility in chess? Well, obviously you can't, partly because it's a game and you've got the other player who's trying to foil you at every moment, but just because the number of possibilities is too great, and any given position you can't really figure out whether it's a good or a bad position. So you need immediately to work to dive into a much more sort of complex, ad hoc, and a strategy for trying to learn to cope with the complicated world of chess. The idea that you could start a chess game without ever having played chess before and think to yourself, well, luckily I've got the economists have given me the rational choice theory, the substandard theory of choice. I can just set off and use it and win every game. Of course you can't. It's just too difficult. And that's a game which is where everything is, in a sense, well defined. I mean, you've got a fixed set of rules. You've got a fixed number of squares on the board. You take turns. Whereas the real world is, of course, vastly more complicated than that. So for someone like Simon, the idea that real action is all about complexity, learning, finding ad hoc strategies that work and reinforcing those, and throwing away strategies that don't work and continually adapting. That's where all the action for intelligence is, and the idea that there's some kind of ideal intelligence, some sort of perfect rationality that we should all be gravitating towards, I think did seem to him a kind of a terrible mistake.
I was pretty astonished by reading Herbert Simon's work on artificial intelligence, which was the book Artificial Intelligences, I think it's called, was written in 1996. And he died way before we had modern AI, and the way he's talking about these systems and how they process information and produce some kind of output, and the analogy he makes to like corporations and to other sort of human institutions, I just thought that for me really is, I mean, that's like a much richer picture of what behavioral science or behavioral economics can do, right? It's much more linked with every level of the economic system. It doesn't just have individuals, and the context in which they exist is kind of abstracted from. So I think, I mean, I want to get onto the main thrust of the book, and we have touched on it, because if people do exist in a context, and if behavioral biases don't explain the many problems that we are encountering, right? Like obesity, like climate change, like retirement funds and pension funds running out of money. What does?
Yes. So I think the first thing to do is to say that I think there are these two perspectives one can look at any problem from. And the one we've been talking about so far is what George and I call the I frame, or individual frame. So it's looking at where are individual people going wrong, supposedly going wrong in some sense, which I think we've been somewhat doubting that there's a very clear sense of what the quote rational or perfect thing to do is. But anyway, the idea is to see the problem as an individual problem. So each person should reduce their carbon footprint, and they should generally tread lightly on the face of the planet, and they should save prudently for retirement, and so on and so on. And the other perspective is what we call the S frame, which is essentially S for system. And there we're sort of considering these rich set of interlocking games we're playing in the sort of economist sense of games, which which govern our interactions with other people and the organisations we're part of, and how those organisations interact with each other, and how they fit into the international order, and all of this stuff, which is enormously intricate and complicated, and which none of us fully can conceive of. And so the thought is that. So the first thing I think that's important is that there's a psychological competition between these two approaches. It's not that they inherently are opposed. It can be the case, clearly, that if one worried about a particular problem, then one can say, well, there's individual factors may be an issue, and systemic factors are an issue. One thing I would say, of course, is that individuals don't change much over the generations. I mean, humans are humans. We haven't changed much in the last 50 years, but we have got a lot more obese. And we haven't changed much. The degree of prudence people have about their finances hasn't changed much, but the way pensions work has really changed a lot. So you might argue that the individual stuff can't be doing all that much explanatory work, both because the time changes over time are so big, and also the changes across nations, the difference between one country and another, are so big as well. But in any case, you can, in principle, hold these views simultaneously. But in truth, the way psychology works, the way our minds work, is that when we're thinking about one perspective on a problem, the other one tends to sort of drift out of our consciousness. So if we think that the problem we have is it's all about me and my individual carbon footprint, we might come on to where that comes from later, then I tend not to think about the fact that we haven't got any kind of global carbon price, cap and trade system. Lots of mechanisms are not in place to actually electrify as quickly as we should be doing, and so on. So I tend to, by thinking about the individual level, I'm defocusing on the systemic level, and the systemic level is where the action is. So one answer to your question, which is only half the answer, I think, is, well, of course, it's all this complicated systemic stuff. But then a more concrete question would be, well, why are things going wrong persistently? I mean, we're clever, adaptive creatures. We're continually inventing new products and services and ways of doing things. If we see a problem, and it's persisting and causing trouble, why aren't we fixing it? And there, I think it's largely the case that where there's a persistent problem, there's some very powerful beneficiary of the status quo. And it sort of sounds kind of gloomy and cynical, but I think it is just standard political economy, really. It's the kind of thing people in the political side of economics have been thinking for 50 years or so. Where there's a stable, persistent problem, there's a reason why that problem is remaining in position, and there's a powerful interest that's benefiting. Which is not to say that powerful interest is inherently evil. It's just part of this complicated economic system. So if you take climate change, for example, one might think, well, why are there various moves being made of radically to very aggressively oppose either the science of climate change being real, or trying to undermine moves towards climate change legislation being enforced nationally or internationally. And of course, there's a very powerful reason, and that's because the fossil fuel companies who are funding a great deal of this, that's their business. That's what they do. So as a fossil fuel company, naturally, you don't want to be shut down, and you can legitimately, within the rules of the game, you can legitimately do a lot of lobbying and political funding and so on to push against that, and you will do that. And then, of course, in the US especially, where political funding laws are very loose, then that lever is a very powerful one. So I think the truth is that the system frame is susceptible to lobbying by powerful interests, but those powerful interests don't want to stress that they're lobbying at that frame particularly. They want to stress that the problem is really an individual problem. That's the sort of sleight of hand. It's saying, if you're a fossil fuel company, so you want to try and convince people that climate change is a problem of individual behaviour. We need to sort ourselves out. But while you're saying that, you're saying, look over here, the I frame, individuals, that's where the action is. At the same time, you're actually working very hard to lobby international organizations and the US government and so on to push in the opposite direction, because you know that the real action is at the S frame.
Yeah, I mean, you really persuaded me. I was, I guess, ideologically inclined towards your position already, but on the other hand, the way you put it, I think, is quite illuminating, because there are so many areas where I think it's what you call responsibilization has
Yes.
taken place. Or is it? I don't think it's your word. Is it somebody else?
Not at all.
Maybe
No,
coined
no.
it.
It comes
Yeah.
from sociology. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So they just like from pension funds to like climate change. You mentioned the carbon
Yep,
footprint to obesity, eating well. You know, we've got
yep,
all of this focus on the individual, and it's a very powerful uh, thing culturally, I think, is in the West, and especially
yeah,
in Anglo countries, where
yeah,
all of our responsibility, all of the responsibility for our own health, as well as, you know, societies and the planets, it all sort of lies with individuals, and we all need to do better. I mean, one thing about this, though, I suppose there are two things I'd like to ask you. So one is, this is really powerful in behavioral science and in economics as well, I think. How do you push back against that with, you know, your colleagues, your peers? The second is very powerful culturally. I think even outside of academia, I think people just, you know, people just have a tendency to say, you know, well, if you're fat, then eat less. It's your own fault. That kind of thing. I think that's
mm.
quite powerful as well. So how do you push against the iframe in those cases?
Yeah. I mean, you're right that the iframe is very natural for us, both as academics and as it's just everyday human beings. I think on the academic side, of course, different bits of the academic world have different perspectives. So I can remember around the time that I was getting very enthusiastic about the nudge movement. I can remember having various. So I was those days I was at UCL, and I remember having various meetings there on climate. I think was the primary topic, and there were various people from politics and law and sociology, I think, and there was me and maybe one or two other psychologists. And I was thinking, are these the lawyers and political scientists and so on? They're just stuck in the past with their. They just don't realize that what we really need to do is just just change people's minds and change people's minds
Mm.
directly. They'll get them to change their behavior, and they're still hung up on the fact that, for example, I remember a discussion about reducing the amount of carbon emissions from the housing stock, and there was a discussion about
Yeah.
the problem that rentals. There's not much incentive for landlords to improve the energy efficiency because they're not paying the bill, and so there needs to be some sort of legal change there, and that's probably dead right, and maybe it's something that's we're moving in the right direction on. But that's I can remember thinking, oh, that's really we're stuck in a sort of dinosaur-like world here where people aren't realizing that it's all about the smart meter on the tabletop and the temperature, better thermometer, and a way of working out how hot your flat is when you're not in it. And so thinking there's this kind of smart tech behavioral kind of solution. And I suppose it's so so the thing is that there's lots of in my world, the world of psychology, and economists are like this too. We're so focused on individuals and and how they make choices that it's so easy to think, well, that's if we can only if we can only get that to work a bit better, that must be where the action is, rather than realizing that people are part of these complicated systems. That most of the choices we make are we're locked into what everyone else is doing around us, and I can't unilaterally, for example, change my diet without having an impact on the other people in my family and on my friends. And I mean, it's just the idea that that I'm a sort of autonomous agent living in a kind of asocial world with my own life to lead is kind of crazy. But there is a world, a part of academia where that's our sort of natural starting point. And so trying to push back at that gates on that is, I suppose, what George and I have done is work quite hard to push the idea that just think about how things change over time, think about how things
Mm.
change across countries, and realize humans are basically the same. So that can't be the humans that are different. Anyway, so that's one side. But your other point, which I think is very important too, is that it's very psychologically natural for us to think in the I frame. So the fact that we naturally think, oh, well, somebody's not saved enough for their retirement. Well, they should have been more prudent. I should have been more careful. To think of it as an individual failing, I think that's exactly what you'd expect from a creature that's adapted and spends its entire life engaged in local interactions with small numbers of other people. We're simply not adapted and able to really cope with vastly complicated
Mm.
social and economic and political systems. I mean, and they're difficult to understand, and they're not our and we can't influence them much anyway. So it's very natural to think, well, the things we can see and which clearly seem to matter and we can influence are the particular behaviors of other people. So we can chastise them and encourage them and so on. And we can think that's the sort of the world, the local world we live in. But that's highly misleading if we then scale that up to think, how do we make the world a better place? We can't do that one individual at a time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you kind of, you have the zealotry of a convert, right? So you clearly you were
Yes.
you really were
Yes.
a true believer in it, but now you you're probably quite effective at persuading people because you know exactly what they are thinking because it is what you used to think. And I mean, one thing that's worth emphasizing, and I had this feeling when reading the book, because I'm basically, headline for those who aren't familiar with this research, most nudges don't work. Like, they don't work. They have small effects on average. There are some cases, there's variability. There's some cases where they do. There are also other cases where they backfire. I have to deal with my students who are so nudge-brained, telling them, your nudge you're doing isn't going to work. Your dissertation, it's not going to work. And they don't believe me, then it doesn't work. And they try to pretend that it did, right? But that's true, right? But I take no pleasure in that, right? It's not, I don't, when I was reading through your book, I was like, oh, the organ donation example where we thought, treating people as opt out to organ donation, so they're automatically by default they're donating their organs. That doesn't really work. Savings for retirement, just boosting people's savings as again a kind of default thing. That doesn't really work. I was just like, this isn't good. I'm not like happy about this. I wish they did work, right? So I think that sense of disappointment, and it's become, I suppose, one thing that your detractors might have against them is that it's almost impossible to deny the failure of nudges right at this point as they were pitched originally.
I think that is true. I think I think one very interesting study looked at a wide range of nudges done by the nudge units in the US, and they looked at the predictions of how well people thought these studies would work who were inside those nudge units versus so essentially practitioners versus academics. And the practitioners were spot on. The practitioners would say things like, well, it's going to work with 2%. 2% would be a good result. And then you might get 2%, or they might get a bit less or a bit more. But the practitioners knew, because they did this all the time, that the effect sizes were really tiny. Now, it might still be that on balance, these are worth having, because some of these, I mean, for example, if you're OPOW of the US power company and you're giving people feedback about other users' energy consumption, you can get between a 1% and 3% energy reduction. That's not going to save the climate. I mean, that's going to solve the climate crisis. But I mean, that's worth doing. That's across a large number of customers. That's it's a big deal. So it's not to say that these things are useless, but the practitioners kind of know the effects are at best small, and they also know that a great many studies just don't work, and you don't know before you start because that's the nature of experimentation. But the academics, including, and I would absolutely have been in this category, they tend to be much more optimistic. And the apparent reason for that is that the academics get overexposed. And of course, your students will be in exactly this situation. They get overexposed to all the successes, or the apparent successes, because of course, all the failures disappear into oblivion and the successes get talked about and published and discussed. So you have this, you can fall into this trap of thinking there's wonderful successes everywhere. And indeed, many of the things that look like successes, when looked at more closely, turn out not to be. So, for example, with the organ donation case, it is true that if you opt everybody in to organ donation, you have more people opted in. So there are more people who are notionally organ donors. But the real question is, does it actually increase the number of transplants you can do? And the answer is not really, because at least in most systems, the real action is if somebody tragically dies, then what are their family going to do? Yeah. And if the family think, well, I have no idea whether they wanted to be an organ donor. They've opted in, but so they didn't opt in. They just didn't opt out. So I have no idea what their wishes would be. Well, so then you haven't actually got the basis to go ahead. I mean, you could have a draconian approach where you say, well, tough luck if you don't opt yourself out, you're going to have your organs harvested. But that's not really a realistic prospect in a democracy, and it's not the way things work. So I remember having a conversation in my days of great enthusiasm for this approach with a transplant surgeon, in fact, and I started a conversation thinking, oh, he's going to be really excited about this. This is go to be, something is right behind. But his immediate reaction was, "Why? That's just solving the wrong problem. That's not the problem we have. We have this really difficult conversation with every family. If you just have a piece of paper which says, well, you didn't opt out, it's just irrelevant." And that's sadly right.
Yeah, no, that was a really interesting. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I think one of the things that's come through is you're just with the nudge, you're just trying to bypass a lot of these really serious legal, logistical, economic, social, ethical issues, right? Just with this neat little trick. And I think the organ example where the family actually look and they're like, well, okay, they ticked a form, but they didn't even tick it. They just didn't untick. Like, that doesn't mean anything. Yeah. We're not going to give you their organs, right? Like, and that's just a really good example of how, policy just needs to be much, much more holistic, right? And it requires resources, and it requires a lot of expertise and effort to actually solve these big problems.
Yeah, so I mean, in Spain, where they do have very high organ donation rates, they just have a really, really holistic, exactly as you say, a holistic system where they work very hard to give people and their families an understanding of what's involved and why it's advantageous. And there's just a lot of general sort of effort by the health service to engage. And it's just a long slog. And there's the idea that one could sort of cut through that was just a charming thought if it were true, but it just turns out not to be. And to think of pick another example. Another one is pensions, where I think there is genuinely some good has come of nudges in relation to pensions, but one of the dangers you can have, there are a couple. I mean, in the UK, if you're defaulted into a pension scheme, which is certainly better than not having a pension scheme, one danger is that you think, oh, I've got a pension now. I don't have to worry about a private pension because I've got one. But what you actually got is probably something extremely minimal, which will actually, it's taking it's basically matching a tiny fraction of your salary. And that's really not going to keep you in retirement. You need to also be thinking about other financial planning. But the danger is you think, well, I don't have to worry about that because I've got this pension. And in the US, you have that problem, but you have a worse problem because the way the pension legislation works is that people can take out pensions particularly when they move employers, for things like mortgages or improvements to the house. So you've got a kind of crazy situation.
The fact that you can borrow against your pension, I just like. But it's a really clear illustration of this principle, right? Because it is a structural feature of the system, like of a very financialized economy, more so maybe than any other sort of major economy, right? And it's just like that just shouldn't be allowed. That's only going to result in problems.
Yeah, no, it's exactly the way the S frame absolutely kills you. That's exactly right. And an example which was very close to my heart is the gambling industry. So, I mean, I have through a company I set up with my friend Henry Stott, was a spin out of Warwick years ago, now independent, but we worked quite a lot with various gambling companies, not ostensibly, and indeed in really to try to identify problem gamblers from their behavior and help them. But then you've got this bizarre situation that the gambling companies are saying, well, we need to identify these problem gamblers and help them. But if you say, yeah, but these fixed odds betting terminals are causing enormous problems, I mean, shouldn't we just not have those? I mean, that seems like an obvious thing. So, oh no, we've really got to. They're very. We need to have triggers in place so that the people in the gambling shop can recognize if a problem's occurring and go over and help. But hang on, you're creating something which is, as is often said, the sort of crack cocaine of gambling. And then you're thinking, we must try and help people who suffer this, who get addicted. But why do we have these fixed odd betting terminals in the first place? Now, legislation has eventually changed, but there is this kind of strange double thing that when you're talking to something like the gambling industry, which is, on the one hand, there are these individuals, the iframe thing, with these individuals, we need to help them. But of course, we're going to create a series of tripwires and traps. And then we're going to say, well, they keep falling over the traps and tripwires. We must help them. It's kind of, the system is clear where the action is. That's what you have to fix.
I mean, one way of thinking about it is that you're nudging, but you've got all of these nudges or dark nudges, they're sometimes called, in the
Mm.
opposite direction, and you've got far more of them, and companies are incentivized to use them. And you've not just got nudges, you've got big economic incentives, and you've got like policies and the law and all these other things pointing in the other direction. So let's say that the theory underpinning your idea for a nudge to reduce gambling in fixed odds betting terminals, let's say that's psychologically sound. You're swimming against the tide, aren't you? There's just too much else going on in the system.
Yeah, and if you're, and I remember actually being encountering one of these fixed odds betting terminals in a gambling company's sort of back room. They said, "Oh, this is what they look like. This is how they work." And of course, it's this just absolute cacophony of nudges pushing, trying to get you to gamble. As noises and fun images and numbers spinning around. And in fact, I can't remember all the details, but it's this kind of thing which is trying to lock you in, get you excited. It's this kind of festival of nudges, all pushing you to gamble. And the idea that you're going to be able to make some sort of small prod which is going to fight all of this is kind of hopeless, really.
Well, I try not to abuse the term evolutionary because it does get abused quite a lot with some armchair reasoning about what evolution is. But it does seem that a lot of our tendencies towards maybe attractions towards bright colours, certain types of sounds that have probably evolved because they're associated with good things like foods, like fruits, right, for instance. Those are... those exist. Those are the way that our brains work. It's not a bias. It's just how our brains work. And they're deliberately exploited, right? They're deliberately exploited by actors in the system. So, yeah, again, it's just this issue of like the motives of these actors. I mean, let me ask you a question. You don't mention it really. I mean, is this about the C word? You don't seem like Marxists, but is the issue the profit motive?
Well, I think not really. I think we would say that the problem is that the profit motive is okay as long as you have the rules of the game set up so that you make profits by doing non-harmful things. So
Mm-hmm.
it's so if you yeah if so there in sort of economist terms, of course, there's this problem of externalities. So if it's the case that by selling me something that so we've got externalities and also internalities, which I think is a word that George had a hand in coining. So the externality, of course, is the standard idea that so I choose something that seems good for me, but it actually has some knock-on bad consequence for somebody else. So, for example, by using my petrol-driven car, I'm generating carbon, and the carbon affects the atmosphere, or I'm polluting polluting by littering a plastic bag. For me, it's okay, but it has this a negative effect on everybody else, and that may not be factored in to the price so that I'm paying. So, in a kind of perfect economy, from a sort of theoretical point of view, all of these externalities would be priced in so that if I'm, as it were, polluting or making negative, having negative impacts on the world, that's going to add to the cost. And conversely, there'll be positive externalities too. So people make inventions which have positive impacts elsewhere, and we probably need to positively externalize those. So that's one thing. But the other thing that George is particularly keen on, and he's very central to behavioral economics really as a discipline, I think, is the idea that there's also such thing as an internality, which is you do something that's good for you now, but it actually has some long-term bad consequence for you. Yeah. So it's your present self is damaging your future self. Now, of course, you don't want to do that, but as you say, we're built to be attracted by shiny things and sugary foods and so on. And the trouble is that if you're a company trying to sell, say, confectionery, or all manner of not necessarily very healthy foods, you're motivated. Your entire profit depends on finding things that people want to buy lots of and eat lots of repeatedly. And that's that's how the business model works. So of course you're designing products that for which that's the case. Now then there's this, and the person buying and eating the product is not in a position really to. Well, certainly the price isn't reflecting the long-term effect on their health. That's not the case, and they can't really figure it out themselves. I mean, how could they? I mean, how can we work out the long-term consequences of a particular thing, immediate actions? It's some sort of enormous epidemiological sort of gigantic sort of challenge. I mean, we can't solve that individually. So, I mean, tobacco is an extreme example of this. Of course, the tobacco industry worked very hard to try and discredit the relationship between smoking and ill health. But the general, it simply can't be the case that we leave it up to individuals to figure out how harmful a particular action is now in relation to the long-term damage it's going to do that very same person. So we have to be, as a society, watching out for each other.
I always think that it's crazy that economists assume that people know the model of the economy when they themselves don't. It's like we don't understand how it all works at all.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, so as a final, another double-barreled question, it's going to be about the reaction you've got. So we've touched on some of this already, but my first question is, how has the pushback been from, for instance, you quote Richard Thaler, who was a pioneer of this, and people who are maybe bought into the I-frame or behavioral economics, or maybe even Chicago school type economics. So how's the pushback from them been? On the other hand, have you had pushback from, like, you mentioned like sociologists, lawyers, anthropologists who've just said to you, like, this is really obvious, you've taken ages to catch up? Like, what's the feedback been like from these two opposing groups?
I think I'll give you three reactions, I think. So the first one coming from people who are in the nudge in the nudge tradition as we were. I think the strongest pushback, I mean, the most convincing pushback is to say, well, this distinction you've got between the I frame and the S frame, it's kind of, you need both. We never said you didn't need the S frame. We just wanted to emphasize the I frame more. And I think George and my counter to that would be, well, there's a lot of rhetoric and a lot of sort of claims which sort of do give the impression that the I-frame can stand as an alternative to S-frame measures, and that's really problematic. So we need to be very, very careful about that, because if we undercut the pressure to change the system because we're pushing the responsibility down on the individual, then we're in trouble. And I think we have all been guilty of that, and I certainly have. But it's still right. I mean, someone like Cass Sunstein would certainly say, well, hang on, but with something like smoking, we've done quite a good job in terms of changing individual attitudes, making it individually kind of more expensive and harder to get hold of cigarettes, and changing all the rules, and that's that sort of conversion effort can be effective. But I still think it's the case that we as a nudge movement have overemphasized the individual. On the other side, you're quite right. If you talk to many people in political science or sociology, they will say, yes, I mean, like, why are you telling me this? I know. I suppose the thing I say to them is, well, first of all, you haven't lived lived in our world, so you probably can't imagine how one can be sort of locked into this individualistic perspective. But on the other hand, if you're in that perspective, it's really important to get out of it, and that's what we're trying to help with. Sure. But I also think there are really important behavioral forces. You talked about the fact that there are many powerful nudge-like efforts being made by corporations on a really industrial scale to nudge us, and we need to understand that. So we need to understand that products are being designed, marketing campaigns are being designed where there's a huge, massive individual behavioral interventions, much more than any government nudge could ever be, and you need to understand the power of that. So really, often I think the action actually is it's regulating and controlling the powerful nudges to push us in the wrong direction. It's more important rather than the so. It is important to understand the individual psychology. That I think it matters where in terms of understanding how we get manipulated. And the third category, which is the more cheering for us, is that there have been quite a lot of people in the sort of behavioral public policy world who've said, oh yeah, it's kind of what I thought anyway. You've kind of come out and said it. So that there are a lot of people who, I think, like George and I, we're sort of feeling, we're sort of uncomfortable with the fact that we feel we should be finding individual solutions that we can't, and the action seems to be elsewhere, seems to be systemic. And I think a lot of people have said, well, I mean, we're with you. We've sort of thought the same thing. Good to have someone saying it out loud. So that's been quite cheering.
No, I completely agree. And I think I actually, because I did my PhD in an economics department, and then I moved to a behavioral science department. And I was quite struck by the focus on nudge. And it took me a couple of years before, for gradually speaking to people like, oh, right, everyone feels the same. Everyone thinks like, why are we focusing so much on nudge? And I think you're right as well, that one of the things this book does really successfully is it uses behavioral science to show you why this particular interpretation of behavioral science isn't good enough, right? It shows you that just focusing on nudge isn't good enough, and it uses behavioral science principles to establish that. So that is you've kind of on a meta level demonstrated what the use of the discipline is. So well, thanks very much, Nick. I know you got to go at 5, so I won't keep you any longer. But it's been really interesting, and like all the people you spoke about, I'm really glad this book's come along, because somebody needed to say behavioral science is really useful for much more than just nudge, and that's what you've done.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Right. Hope you're all listening. You weren't, were you? You're just sitting there playing Elden Ring or whatever. Anyway. So, that's that. That was Professor Nick Shater. Wasn't as long an interview as I would have liked, but it was good, and the book's good. If you want to know about behavioral science from a non-nudge perspective, then read it. And stop messing around. If you're not reading it, what are you doing with your life? Seriously.